So we're talking about an infrastructure which is collapsing. We're talking about China investing far more in terms of the GNP into infrastructure improvement than we are. We're talking about being in the midst of a major recession where we desperately want to grow jobs, and yet this proposal does not add 1 cent into our infrastructure. Now, again, I'm going back to the very good book written by Arianna Huffington called Third World America. She writes, as bad as America's sewers, roads, bridges, dams, and water and power systems are, they pale in comparison to the crisis we are facing in our schools. I'm not talking about the physical state of our dilapidated public school buildings, although the National Education Association estimates that it would take $322 billion to bring America's school buildings into good repair. I have been in schools in Vermont and elsewhere which were old and crumbling, and I have been in schools which are new and state-of-the-art. And I think anyone who has seen the contrast in terms of the attitude of the students in those types of schools will understand that it is important to give these kids good places in which to learn and to grow. It means a lot to them when they see a building that is new, that has state-of-the-art equipment, as opposed to one that is crumbling. It suggests to them what we as a society feel about them. And she writes, Arianna Huffington writes, that nothing is quickening our descent into third world status faster than our resounding failure to properly educate our children. This failure has profound consequences for our future, both at home and as we look to compete with the rest of the world in the global economy. Historically, education, she writes, has been the great equalizer, and that is certainly the case. That has been the incredible virtue of our public school system. What we have taken is kids who spent, my father never went to graduate high school, my mother did, that was it, and given young people, millions of young people, the opportunity to get a good education in school and be able to go to college and use their potential. The springboard to the middle class and beyond has been education. It was a promise we made to all of our people. What we as a nation said, that regardless of your income, we're going to provide you with the best possible education in order to succeed in life. And that is something extraordinary. That no matter what your income is, we're going to provide you with a great education. I, as a kid, went to public schools, and I did have a very good education. But something has gone in recent years terribly wrong, and we have slipped further and further behind many other countries. Among 30 developed countries ranked by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that's the OECD, the United States ranked 25th in math and 21st in science. 25th in math, 21st in science. Even the top 10% of American students, our best and brightest, ranked only 24th in the world in math literacy. There was another study, I think probably just a more updated OECD study that came out just the other day. It was reported in the New York Times, where kids in Shanghai were leading the world in these types of tests as compared to our own students. They are studied, they have better schools, better teachers, more investments in their education, and there's a culture there. There is a culture. It's not fair to blame the kids. Does anyone seriously believe that in the United States of America we take intellectual development seriously? Just reading today, I don't remember the guy's name. Was it a basketball player, a baseball player? Was just signing a contract for some untold tens of millions of dollars, and yet you have teachers starting off at $30,000, $32,000. Is anyone going to suggest in a serious way that we reward people who become child care workers or teachers? We have child care workers who leave taking care of little kids, which may be the most important job in our society. because it is the brain development that takes place between 0 and 3 that is a large part of what a human being becomes. People leave early childhood education in order to move up the economic ladder and get a job at McDonald's, because pay is so low, benefits are so low. What are we doing as a nation? What are we doing as a nation? And she writes that a national assessment of educational progress report found that just 33% of U.S. fourth graders and 32% of eighth graders were proficient in reading, etc., etc. So I think her point is that if we are not going to become a third world nation, we have got to start investing in this country, in our physical infrastructure, in our human infrastructure, and in our educational infrastructure. Let me just give you some examples of what this means in real terms. Today, unemployment in our country, the official unemployment, is 9.8%. For those without a high school diploma, it is 15.6%, compared to 5.6% for college graduates. 67% of high school graduates don't have enough of the skills required for success in college and the 21st century workforce. As many as 170,000 high school graduates each year are prepared to go on to college but can't afford that. Let me repeat that. About 170,000 young people in this country who graduate high school, who want to go to college, are unable to do it because they can't afford it. Are we nuts? What are we doing in wasting the extraordinary intellectual potential of all of these young people? What we're saying to them is, because you don't have the money, and because college is so expensive, and because our federal government is more busy giving tax breaks to billionaires and fighting 2 wars, we are not investing in you. That makes no sense at all. When you invest in your kids, you're investing in the future of America. They are America. And if they are not well educated, how are they going to become productive members of society? How are we going to compete against China and Europe and other countries around the world that are investing in education? And here's something that we don't talk about enough. The fastest growing occupations are those that require higher levels of education and greater technical competence. So you got a problem, it's true in Vermont and it's true all over the country, that you have jobs out there, good jobs, and those jobs cannot be filled because our young people don't have the job skills to fill them. Now, how absurd is that? I remember there was a piece in one of the papers, I think it was in Ohio, where after the worst of the recession and a lot of layoffs, I think it was Ohio, they were beginning to rehire workers. And the companies, these were sophisticated high-tech jobs. They brought workers in, and they brought them in, and they brought them in. And they couldn't come up with the number of workers they needed to fill the jobs that they had. What does that say about our educational system? Data from Alliance for Excellent Education, 2009. 1,800 Vermont dropouts cost the state $459 million of lost lifetime earnings for the state and $19.4 million in health care costs. In other words, what everybody understands, if you don't invest in your young people, they are not going to become productive, tax-paying workers. As often as not, they will get involved in self-destructive activity, drugs, crime, whatever. They'll end up in jail, and we end up spending tens of thousands of dollars keeping them in jail rather than seeing them out there as productive members of society, contributing their fair share in taxes. The Urban Institute says that we can reduce child poverty, which I mentioned earlier, is the highest in the industrialized world, by 35% if we provide child care subsidies to families with income less than 50% of state median. This is an issue I feel very, very strongly about. It is, to me, beyond comprehension that in Vermont and throughout this country, it is extremely difficult for working-class families to find affordable, good-quality childcare. We're not back in the 1950s where daddy went to work and mommy stayed home taking care of the kids. Mom is at work as well. And you have families all over this country, middle-class, working-class families that are saying, you know, I cannot find quality childcare where I'm comfortable leaving my 2-year-old or 3-year-old. Can't find that childcare at a rate that I can afford. And in this area, again, we are far behind many other countries around the world because kids who do not get intellectually challenging early childhood education, kids who do not get the emotional support they need from 0 to 3 to 4, they will enter school already quite behind other kids. And then 5 years later, 10 years later, they'll be dropping out of school and they'll be doing drugs and they'll be ending up in jail at great expense. How long does it take us to understand that investing in our children, our youngest children, is enormously important for our country, and it is a good investment. It is much better to invest in childcare than in keeping people locked up in jails. Mr. President, 75% of American youth who apply to the military are ineligible to serve because of low cognitive capacities, criminal records, or obesity. I mean, this is really quite unbelievable. We're not only now talking about not being able to compete internationally because we are not bringing forth the kind of educated people that we need because of the inadequacies of our schools and childcare and so forth. This almost becomes a national security issue, if you like. 75% of American youth who apply to the military are ineligible to serve because of low cognitive capabilities, capacities, criminal records, or obesity. Mr. President, you know, it gives me no pride, no happiness to bring forth these statistics. But as a nation, we're going to have to grasp these things. Either we can ignore these things. Either we can run away from reality, put our heads, underneath the carpet here, or we can say that we are not going to allow America to become a third world nation, that we're going to turn this country around, but we're not going to turn the country around unless we rethink our priorities. And one of our priorities cannot be more tax breaks for the richest people in this country. Mr. President, from the 1960s to 2006, the U.S., the United States, fell from 1st to 18th out of 24 industrialized nations in high school graduation rates. Now, what happens in today's economy if a kid does not graduate high school? And if my memory is correct, about 30% of our kids, and I know these figures are fuzzy because it's hard to determine who is dropping out and not, but my understanding is about 30% of our kids drop out of high school. What happens to those kids? Where do they go? What kind of jobs do they have? How many of them end up in jail? How many of them do drugs? As a nation, I think we can do a lot better than that. We should not have gone from 1st to 18th out of 24 industrialized nations in high school graduation rates. Mr. President, dropouts are 8 times more likely to be incarcerated. In other words, when kids fail in school, they are going to end up in jail 8 times more likely. 82% of those in prison are high school dropouts. States, it was funny, I'll tell you a funny experience. I was in Burlington last week, and I met this fellow, and he came up and he was chatting with me, and he said, well, I just got out of jail. And what really struck me is he was a well-educated young man. He was very articulate. I suspect he had gone to college, and what really struck me is how rare that is. As the statistics amply demonstrate, the people who end up in jail overwhelmingly are high school dropouts, people who don't have the education to make it in the world. President, when we talk about the need to substantially increase funding for early childhood education, we should understand that state-funded pre-K programs currently serve 24% of 4-year-olds and 4% of 3-year-olds. In other words, there are millions of families that would like to see their kids be able to access good quality child care, but just can't find that in their states. Mr. President, again, in contrast to giving tax breaks to billionaires who don't need it, and in some cases are not even asking for it, the younger the age of investment in human capital, the higher the rate of return on that investment. If society invests early enough, it can raise cognitive and socio-emotional levels and the health of disadvantaged kids. You don't need to be a psychologist to understand that. If kids get off to a good start in life, if they have the intellectual support, the intellectual development, the emotional support, those kids are much, much more likely to do well in school, much less likely to drop out, much less likely to be a burden on society, much less likely to end up in jail, much less likely to do drugs, etc. This is an investment that we should be making. Mr. President, I want to get back for a moment to the agreement that the President made with the Republican leadership and why I think it is a bad agreement and why I believe we can do much better. And the way we are going to improve this agreement is when millions of people all over this country say, wait a second, this was an agreement reached behind closed doors. There are members in the House and the Senate who are upset that we didn't know about the agreement. What about the average American out there? I wonder how many people really believe that it makes a lot of sense with a $13.7 trillion national debt to be giving huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country. And I got to tell you, Mr. President, the calls in my office are coming 98, 99% to 1 against these agreements. People think we can do better, and our job is to do better. And the way we do better is when people all over this country stand up and say, wait a minute, Congress, your job is to represent the middle class, to represent our kids, and not to represent the wealthiest people in this country. Now, I mentioned earlier, and I think certainly one of the major objections to this agreement is that it provides tens of billions of dollars to the wealthiest people in this country at a time when the rich are already doing phenomenally well, and at a time when the wealthiest people have already experienced huge tax breaks. I think most people think that that does not make sense. And let me just give you an example. I just want to, not to pick on particular individuals, that's not my goal here, but just so you know this. According to the Citizens for Tax Justice, if the Bush tax breaks for the top 2% are extended, these are some of the people who will benefit and what kind of benefits they will receive. Rupert Murdoch, the CEO of News Corporation, would receive a $1.3 million tax break next year. Mr. Murdoch is a billionaire. Do you really think he needs that? Jamie Dimon, the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, whose bank got a $29 billion bailout from the Federal Reserve, would receive a $1.1 million tax break. Trust me, Jamie Dimon, the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, he is doing just fine. Vikram Pandit, the CEO of Citigroup, a bank that got a $50 billion bailout, he would receive $785,000 tax breaks. Ken Lewis, the former CEO of Bank of America, a bank that got a $45 billion bailout. Guys who are already fabulously wealthy would receive a $713,000 a year tax break. The CEO of Wells Fargo, these are the largest banks in America. CEOs of these banks already making huge compensation. he would get, John Stumpf, who's the CEO of Wells Fargo, would receive $813,000 tax break every single year. The CEO of Morgan Stanley, John Mack, whose bank got a $10 billion bailout, would receive a $926,000 a year tax break. The CEO of Aetna, Ronald Williams, would receive a tax break worth $875,000. Now, Mr. President, I contrast that, as I did earlier, to the fact that 2 days ago, you and I and a total of 53 members of the Senate said, you know, maybe we should provide a $250 check this year to seniors on Social Security and to disabled vets because they haven't gotten a COLA for 2 years. $250 check. People making $14,000, $15,000 a year desperately need a little bit of help. We couldn't get one Republican vote. But when it comes to the CEO of a major bank who's already a multi-millionaire, we're talking about $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, $1 million a year in tax breaks. That is not what we should be doing as a nation. Furthermore, Mr. President, I know that President Obama and others have said, well, let's not worry because these tax breaks are just temporary. They're only going to be given for 2 years. I have been in Washington long enough to know that when you give a temporary tax break for 2 years, you are in fact giving a long-term tax break or maybe even a permanent tax break. Because 2 years from now, the exact same arguments will be made. That if you do away with those tax breaks for the rich, you're really raising taxes, you really want to raise taxes, terrible thing to do. And that same argument will be made. But there is one difference. And the difference is that when President Obama ran for president, and since he has been president, he has time and time again come out against those tax breaks. He does not believe in them, and I believe him. I know that he doesn't. But if he says, if he is the Democratic candidate for president, that elect me or re-elect me to be president because then in the future I'm really going to get rid of these tax breaks, I'm afraid that his credibility is not very, very high because that's what he said last time. And you can only cry wolf. I guess there's a limit to how many times you can cry wolf. So I think let's not kid ourselves. If these tax breaks for the wealthiest people are extended for 2 years, there is a very, very strong likelihood that they will be extended for many, many years beyond these 2 years and perhaps even permanently, which brings us back to the Bush-era nonsense of believing that tax breaks for the rich and trickle-down economics are going to help the middle class and working families of this country. But while the personal income tax issue and extending them for the top 2% has received a lot of national attention, what has not gotten a whole lot of discussion is that that is not the only unfair and absurd tax proposal out there. The agreement struck between the president and the Republican leadership continues the Bush-era 15% tax rate on capital gains and dividends, meaning that those people who make their living off of their investments will continue to pay a substantially lower tax rate than firemen, teachers, and nurses. So if you are a wealthy person and you earn, and I believe that the overwhelming majority of capital gains benefits accrue to the top 1%, you're going to be paying a tax on that income of 15%, which is less than you pay if you are a fireman, whether you're a police officer, you're a teacher, or a nurse. So what we are doing there is extending not only the personal income tax breaks for the very rich, but a host of other taxes as well. Mr. President, on top of all of that, and I know that many of my colleagues have picked up on this and are extremely upset, and I think it's one of the reasons why the Democrats in the House just yesterday said that they do not want to bring this proposal to the floor for a vote, is that this agreement includes a horrendous proposal regarding the estate tax. And the estate tax, as some may know, was a proposal that Teddy Roosevelt talked about in the year 1906, and was eventually enacted in 1916. And here is what Teddy Roosevelt said about this issue in August of 2010, and I quote, and it's worth repeating that, because what the proposal struck between the president and the Republican leader is lower the estate tax. And here's what Teddy Roosevelt said in 2010. And here's a chart with his words. He said, "The absence of effective state and especially national restraint upon unfair money-getting has tended to create a small class of enormously wealthy and economically powerful men whose chief object is to hold and increase their power." This is Teddy Roosevelt, who by then had served as President of the United States. No man, this is Roosevelt, no man should receive $1 unless that dollar has been fairly earned. Every dollar received should represent $1's worth of service rendered, not gambling in stocks, but service rendered. End of quote. My goodness, this guy was pretty prophetic. This is back in 1910. Then he continues. The really big fortune, the swollen fortune, by the mere fact of its size acquires qualities which differentiate it in kind as well as in degree from what is passed by men of relatively small means. Therefore, I believe in a graduated inheritance tax on big fortunes, properly safeguarded against evasion and increasing rapidly in amount with the size of the state. End of quote. Wow. Teddy Roosevelt hit the nail on the head. And that was 100 years ago. What he worried about is that a small group of people with incredible money would be able to pass that money on, and that what you would create in this country is an oligarchic form of government with a few people holding not just enormous economic power, but holding significant political power as well. And it is ironic that right now, as a result of this disastrous Citizens United decision, that what Roosevelt foretold, predicted, is exactly what's happening. You have a handful of billionaires now sitting around deciding how much of their fortune they're going to invest in political campaigns all over this country to defeat people like me who are opposed to their agenda and support other people who are in agreement with their agenda. That's what Roosevelt talked about. That is exactly what is happening. So what we are looking at is, in this proposal, we are looking at a situation where the estate tax rate, which was 55% under President Clinton, will decline to 35% with an exemption on the first $5 million of an individual's estate, $10 million for couples. Now here's the important point that has to be made, because I think a lot of people don't understand it. And certainly our Republican friends have done a very, very good job in distorting reality on this one. There are millions of Americans who believe that when they die, their children will have to pay an estate tax. That is absolutely and categorically incorrect. As this chart shows, only a tiny fraction of estates from deaths in 2009 owed any estate tax. That number is about 0.24%. Less than 0.3% of American families paid any tax on the estates that they were left. 99.7% of American families did not pay 1 cent in estate taxes. And that's the simple truth. The so-called death tax that our Republican friends talk about a whole lot is the estate tax. 99.7% of families don't pay a nickel on it. And the people who do pay are not the rich, it is the very, very, very rich. And let me just give you one example of the absurdity of lowering the tax rate, or even worse, of ending the estate tax, as some of my Republican colleagues would like to do. And here's this chart, just to give you one example of what ending. This agreement does not do that, it just lowers the rates. But if they were to wipe out completely, as the Republicans want to do, Walmart's owners, that's Sam Walton's family, Waltons own Walmart, they are the heirs to the Walmart fortune, which is worth, this may be dated, maybe more, maybe less now, about $86 billion. That's what this family is worth. One family, $86 billion. They're doing pretty good. If we abolish the estate tax, as our Republican friends would have us do, the Walton family alone would receive an estimated $32.7 billion tax break if the estate tax was completely repealed. One family, $32.7 billion. This is patently insane. This is insane. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. We have massive unemployment. I am trying to get senior 50+ million people a $250 check. By the way, a $250 check, because we have not seen a COLA for the last 2 years for seniors, disabled vets. That would cost in 1 year about $14 billion. The Walton family itself would get more than double in a tax break, what some of us are fighting for over 50 million seniors and disabled vets. So we can't afford to give $14 billion to help some of the people in this country who are struggling the hardest. Can't do that. But somehow we can afford to give $32.7 billion in tax breaks to one of the richest families in this country. If that makes sense to anybody, please call up my office, because it doesn't make sense to me, and I think it does not make sense to the vast majority of the American people. So under this agreement, the estate tax rate, which was 55% under President Clinton, will decline to 35%, with an exemption on the first $5 million of an individual's estate, $10 million for couples. And let us remember again that this tax applies only to the top 0.3% of the families in this country. And this, again, is not just a tax break for the rich, it is a tax break for the very, very rich. And again, this agreement says, well, we're only going to extend this for 2 years. Well, frankly, I doubt that very much. I suspect 2 years from now, the same argument, they will be extending it. And frankly, our Republican colleagues representing the richest people in the world are hell-bent on abolishing the estate tax completely. So those are some of the reasons that I think we should be voting against this agreement. Third, Mr. President, and this is an issue I have been talking about, and I'm happy to hear that there is more discussion about in the last few days, and that is the so-called payroll tax holiday. And what that is about is that this would cut $120 billion in Social Security payroll tax for workers. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a very good idea, because the worker, instead of paying 6.2% into Social Security, pays 4.2%. But I think if you think about it for 2 seconds, you really understand that it's not a good idea, because this is money being diverted from the Social Security Trust Fund. And Social Security, in my view, has been the most successful federal program in perhaps the history of our country. In the last 75 years, whether in good times or bad times, Social Security has paid out every nickel owed to every eligible American. Today, Social Security has a $2.6 trillion surplus. Today, Social Security can pay out benefits for the next 29 years. Our goal, and what we must do, is make sure that we extend it beyond 29 years to the next 75 years. Well, if you divert $120 billion from the Social Security Trust Fund and you give it to workers today, what you're doing is cutting back and the viability, the long-term viability of Social Security. That is not just Bernie Sanders raising this issue. There are many people representing millions of senior citizens who are deeply concerned about this proposal, this provision in the agreement between the President and the Republican leadership. The National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare is one of the very largest senior groups in America. They do a very good job. I know we have many seniors in Vermont who are members of this organization, and their job is to do what the title of the organization suggests, and that is to preserve Social Security and Medicare. And just the other day, they sent out a news release, and the title of the news release was, and I quote, "Cutting contributions to Social Security signals the beginning of the end. Payroll tax holiday is anything but." And let me quote from Barbara Kennelly, who is a former member of Congress. She's the president, CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. And what she writes is that, quote, "Even though Social Security contributed nothing to the current economic crisis, it has been bartered in a deal that provides deficit-busting tax cuts for the wealthy." Diverting, and that's what we're doing here, $120 billion in Social Security contributions for a so-called tax holiday may sound like a good deal for workers now, but it's bad business for the program that a majority of middle-class seniors will rely upon in the future. End of quote. Barbara Kennelly, President of the CEO. Mr. President, I think many of us should understand where this concept really originated. This is not a progressive idea. This is an idea that came from Republicans and conservatives who want to end Social Security. And I want to read you an interesting quote from a gentleman named Bruce Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett is a former top advisor for Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And this is what he wrote in opposition to this payroll tax cut. And this is a guy who was an advisor to President Reagan and the first President Bush. And this is what he said. He said, quote, "What are the odds that Republicans will ever allow this one-year tax holiday to expire? They wrote the Bush tax cuts with explicit expiration dates, and then when it came time for the law they wrote to take effect exactly as they wrote it, they said any failure to extend them permanently would constitute the biggest tax increase in history." End of quote for a moment. So what Mr. Bartlett is saying, and I'm going to go back to his quote in a second, what he's saying is we all know to be true, that around here in Congress, if you provide a tax break for 1 year, in this case a payroll tax holiday, a year from now, if you restore the old rates, which are 6.2%, our Republicans' friends are going to say Democrats are raising your taxes. It ain't going to happen. This 1 year extension could well become a permanent extension, and if it becomes a permanent extension, you are diverting a huge amount of money to Social Security, and you are weakening the entire financial structure of Social Security in this country, which I expect is exactly what some would like to do. Now, President Obama says, well, not to worry, it's only 1 year, and don't worry, that 1 year is going to be covered by the federal government. So for the very first time, out of the Treasury Department, money is going to come into Social Security, which has always been 100% dependent, as it should be, on payroll taxes. For the first time, we're breaking that. And around here, you do it once, it is going to continue. What Barbara Kennelly, the president of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, says is cutting these contributions to Social Security signals the beginning of the end. So we should be very, very, very mindful of that. We should not support this payroll tax. It is one of the more dangerous provisions in this agreement. But let me get back now, if I might, Mr. President, to what Bruce Bartlett, who was the former top advisor for Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush, recently wrote. And I'm continuing his quote. Quote, "If allowing the Bush tax cuts to expire is the biggest tax increase in history, one that Republicans claim would decimate a still fragile economy, then surely expiration of a payroll tax holiday would also constitute a massive tax increase on the working people of America. Republicans would prefer," this is Bruce Bartlett, "Republicans would prefer to destroy Social Security's finances or permanently fund it with general revenues than allow a once-suspended payroll tax to be reimposed. Arch Social Security hater Peter Ferraro once told me that funding it with general revenues was part of his plan to destroy it by converting Social Security into a welfare program rather than an earned benefit. He was right," end of quote. And once again, that quote is from Bruce Bartlett, a former top advisor for Presidents Reagan and the first President Bush. So what he is saying, and this is maybe one of the sleeping issues in this agreement between the President and the Republican leadership, is we may be taking a huge step forward in destroying the most important program in this country, which is Social Security, by diverting now $120 billion and in the future hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars into this program, so that in fact it will not be there for our kids and our grandchildren. Mr. President, the fourth point that I want to make in opposition to this agreement, and one that I've made before and read a little bit about, is that while some of the business taxes in this agreement may work to create jobs, some of them won't, but the more important point is that economists on both ends of the political spectrum believe that the better way to spur the economy and to create the millions and millions of jobs that we must create is to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. Just a few minutes ago, I read from excerpts from a very good book by a friend of mine, Ariana Huffington, entitled A Third World America. And the purpose of her book was to give us a warning that if we as a nation do not get our act together in a variety of ways, including our physical infrastructure, we are headed down the pike to be a third world nation. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, we as a nation need to spend $2.2 trillion in the next 5 years alone in order to take care of our infrastructure needs. But unfortunately, this agreement signed by the President and the Republicans doesn't put one penny into infrastructure. So I think that if we are serious about creating jobs, if we're serious about making sure that our economy can be competitive in the global economy, we've got to be watching what other countries are doing, and they're investing far, far more than we are. I can tell you, Mr. President, and the stimulus package, by the way, will help us very much in Vermont on this area. But right now, if you were to drive around the state of Vermont, and I think in many other places in this country, and you took out your cell phone, you would find it very hard to make calls in a number of areas of the state. A few months ago, I was literally 1.5 miles away from our state capital in Montpelier, near Northfield, Vermont. I could not make a telephone call with my cell phone. And that's true in many parts of Vermont. That's true in many areas of America. We are lagging behind many, many other countries in terms of the accessibility of cell phone service and broadband. So I am happy to say that in Vermont, we received a very generous grant through the stimulus package. It is going to help us. Other states did the same. But that's the area that we have got to invest. You've got to invest in broadband. You've got to invest in making sure that cell phone service is available in rural America, all over America. I talked a moment ago about our train services. There are train services today which are worse than they were 30 or 40 years ago. It takes longer to get from destination A to destination B. China is investing huge sums of money building high-speed rail at a rate that we could not even dream about. So in this agreement, we do have money for business tax cuts, but I do not think that that is the best way to invest taxpayer money if we're serious about creating the jobs that we need. Corporate America already is sitting on close to $2 trillion cash on hand. I don't know that more tax breaks are going to help them very much. I think that it is a lot smarter, and I think most economists agree with me, that we should be investing in our infrastructure, both to create jobs now and to improve our competitiveness in years to come. Further, Mr. President, I want to say a word on this. I mentioned it earlier today. President Obama talks about this being a compromise agreement. You can't get everything you want, and I certainly understand that. But one of the aspects of the compromise he points to is an extension of unemployment benefits for 13 months. Well, let me be very clear. I think at a time when 2 million of our fellow Americans are about to lose their unemployment, at a time when unemployment is extraordinarily high, long-term unemployment is, I think, higher than at any point on record. People are, looking for work month after month after month and not finding it. It would be morally unacceptable if this country did not extend unemployment benefits for those workers for 13 months. And yet the president sees this as a great sign of compromise. I would argue the contrary. I would suggest to you, Mr. President, that for the past 40 years, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, under Democratic and Republican leadership here in the Senate or in the House, whenever the unemployment rate has been above 7.2% unemployment insurance has always been extended. In other words, this has been bipartisan policy for 40 years, and I don't want to see us seeing and accepting as a really great give on the part of Republicans, a really, something that they're giving us as part of a compromise when it's been bipartisan policy for 40 years under Democratic and Republican leadership. So I don't accept that this is a great gift. I think what the American people understand is you don't turn your backs on unemployed workers. People have been unemployed for long periods of time. You don't allow those people to lose their homes. You don't force these people out onto the streets. You don't take away shreds of dignity they have remaining. That is not what you do, and that has always been Republican philosophy as well as Democratic philosophy. This is not a great gift. So I do not accept that this is a compromise. Mr. President, let me be very clear, as I said earlier, that I do believe that there are positive parts of this agreement that must be maintained as we move forward toward a better agreement. And let me give you just some of them that make a lot of sense to me, that we have got to retain and build on. The obvious one is, in addition to extending unemployment benefits, it's clear that we have got to extend middle-class tax cuts for 98% of Americans, as I've been documenting over and over again today. We are looking at a situation where the middle class in this country is collapsing. Under President Bush, median family income went down by $2,200. People are losing their health care, and it would be asinine, it would be unacceptable if the middle class did not continue to receive the tax breaks that were developed in 2001 and 2003. And that, to a large degree, what this fight is about. We've got to extend those tax breaks for the middle class, but not tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires. Further in this agreement, there are some other good provisions. You got the earned income tax credit for working Americans, and the child and college tax credits are also in this agreement, and they are very, very important. They will keep millions of our fellow Americans from slipping out of the middle class and into poverty, and they will allow millions of our fellow citizens to send their kids to college. Just talked about a moment ago that we have over 100,000 families in this country where kids graduate high school, want to go to college, can't afford to do it. This proposal will help them do that, and that's right. But, Mr. President, despite the fact that there are some good, important provisions in this proposal, when we look at the overall package, when we look at a $13.7 trillion national debt and a declining middle class, I think what we have got to say is that this package just doesn't do it. It's just not good enough. Now, the president says that he knows how to count votes, and I understand that. He says, well, you know, you had a couple of votes here to make sure that we would not give tax breaks to millionaires, and the president has been very clear. He does not want to do that. I understand that. But he says, what choice do I have? And I think the answer is, we have got to fight this issue. In my view, this solution ultimately will not be resolved here inside the Beltway, in the Senate or in the House. It will be resolved when millions of Americans get on their telephones and get on their computers and let their senators and their members of House of Representatives know that they are profoundly outraged. That at a time when the rich have never had it so good, and when we have a huge national debt, that this agreement contains huge tax breaks for those people who don't need it. That's how we defeat this. I'm not sure that alone, you know, here in a debate, I'm going to turn any of my Republican or some Democratic colleagues around. But I do believe that if people all over this country stand up and say, wait a minute, how much do the richest people in this country want? We just documented a few moments ago. The top 400 wealthiest people in this country saw a doubling of their income under President Bush, a doubling of their income. Tax rates went down. When is enough? When is enough enough? How much do they need? So I think, and I would hope, by the way, that this is certainly not just a progressive issue. I'm a progressive. This is a conservative issue. I have heard year after year, Mr. President, our conservative friends telling us, my goodness, we just cannot continue to raise the national debt. We've got to do something about this unsustainable deficit. This agreement grows, increases the national debt. What kind of honest conservative can vote to increase the national debt? And if they do, please, no more lectures here on the floor of the Senate. Your hypocrisy will be known to everybody. Don't tell us that you're concerned about the national debt, give tax breaks to billionaires, and raise the national debt so that our kids and grandchildren in the middle class will have to pay higher taxes in order to pay off the debt that was caused by you giving tax breaks to millionaires. Please, no more lectures on that issues. Just say, okay, rich people contributed to my campaign. I got to do what they want. That would be honest. Please, no more lectures about your concern about the national debt. Now, again, I want to reiterate this point. And that is, everybody says, don't worry, these are only 2 years. These are not, in my view, 2 years. If you do them for 2 years, the same old argument will be back 2 years from now, and we will be in the midst of a presidential election. And what our Republican friends will say, as sure as I am standing here, and I'm glad we have a gentleman putting this in the congressional record. I want people to go back to the congressional record. I am sure I will be proven right. That 2 years from now, our Republican friends will come back and they will say, oh my word, if you repeal these tax breaks, you're going to be raising taxes. We can't do that. And what will make the situation even more difficult 2 years from now than today is you have President Obama, if he's the Democratic candidate 2 years from now, he'll say, oh, I don't believe in these tax breaks for the rich. I'm going to do my best to repeal them. But his credibility has been damaged because that's what he said in the last campaign. That's what he has been saying all along. The president does not believe in extending these tax breaks to the wealthy. I know that. Everybody knows that. But if he caves in now, who is going to believe that he's not going to do the same thing 2 years from now? That's the damage. And then what's even, I think, more troublesome is that once we move down this path of more tax breaks for the very, very wealthy, we are accepting the heart and soul of trickle-down economics which has been, to my mind, a proven disaster and a failure. I would remind the listeners and my colleagues that these tax breaks have been in existence since 2001. They were in existence throughout almost all of President Bush's tenure. The end result was that we lost 600,000 private sector jobs. Lost 600,000 private sector jobs. The worst job performance record maybe in the history of this country. Trickle-down economics does not work. Giving tax breaks to billionaires does not stimulate the economy. Helping working families and the middle class get decent jobs. Tax breaks for people who need the money and are going to spend the money is what creates jobs, not giving tax breaks to billionaires who don't need it and who are not going to spend it. So again, the point that I want to make here is that if people think, oh, this is just temporary, this is just 2 years, I believe you're kidding yourselves. I believe that 2 years from now, the debate will be about extending them or perhaps even making them permanent. And at a time, as I mentioned earlier, where the top 1% has seen a huge increase in the percentage of income they earn in this country, going from 8% in the 1970s to 23.5% now, where the top 1% now earns more income than the bottom 50%. It is totally absurd to be giving tax breaks to people who don't need them, and it is not good economics as well. And here's the other irony. As I also mentioned earlier, I guess by this time I'm going to be doing a little repetition here, but as I mentioned earlier, you have a number of millionaires and some of the richest people in this country who will benefit from these tax breaks. You know what they're saying? You know what Warren Buffett is saying? You know what Bill Gates is saying? You know what Ben Cohen from Ben & Jerry's is saying? And many, many other wealthy people are saying, hey, thanks very much. I don't need it. It's more important that you invest in our children. It's more important that you protect working families. We're doing just fine. Thanks. Our incomes have soared. Our tax rates have gone down. We don't need it. In other words, we have the absurd situation is that not only is this bad public policy, we are actually forcing tax breaks on people who don't need them and don't even want them. Richest people in this country, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, we don't want it. Now, here's something else. Here's something else that needs to be understood. What the Republicans are doing in this agreement is driving up the national debt. And you may think, well, that's not what Republicans really believe in. They're supposed to be conservatives. They don't want a high national debt. Why would they be giving tax breaks to the rich and driving up the national debt? Well, there is a rationale. These guys are not dumb, and I think they know what they're doing. And here's what the argument is. If you drive up the national debt and the deficit, you then come back to the floor of the Senate and you say, you know what? This national debt and deficit is unsustainable, and the only way that we can deal with it now is by cutting. And we are already beginning to hear how some of those thoughts are going to develop. There was, as you know, Mr. President, a deficit reduction commission appointed by the president. And I had when I heard who was going to be chairing that commission, or co-chairing it, and Alan Simpson, a very nice gentleman, but a very, very conservative Republican who has attacked Social Security for a very long period of time, Erskine Bowles, a conservative Democrat, I had very serious doubts about what was going to come out of that commission. Now, the good news is they needed 14 votes to pass their recommendations. They didn't get the 14. But a lot of the ideas that Senator Simpson and Mr. Bowles developed are going to be filtering around this institution. And what the Republicans will say is that when you have a huge debt, which they helped create, we're going to have to cut. And what are we going to have to do? As you recall, Mr. President, that Deficit Reduction Commission recommended a savage cut, over 20% in Social Security benefits for young workers. Major cuts. There was talk about raising the Social Security age up to, I think, 69. They're talking about cuts in Medicare, cuts in Medicaid, cuts in education. I mean, right now, is I think I've documented a dozen times, it is a horrendous situation when so many of our young people can't afford to go to college, and the others who do go to college and graduate, they end up on average something like $25,000 in debt. These guys on the Deficit Reduction Commission were recommending that the interest on that debt be accrued while students were in college. So here we're slipping behind the rest of the world in terms of our percentage of graduates, college graduates, and this recommendation is on young people who don't have a lot of money, who are borrowing money, they've got to pay more to go to college. But you're going to see it, and here's the argument. Good, it's going to be in the congressional record. Check it out, see if I'm right. The argument will be deficit is going up, national debt is going up, we got to attack and cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans programs. This year, Mary Landrieu made this point, Senator Landrieu of Louisiana made the point a little while ago. She said, I think this is roughly right, our soldiers, men and women in the armed forces, are going to get a 1.8% increase in their salaries this year, 1.8%. People putting their lives on the line to defend this country. $250 check for 50 plus million seniors and disabled vets. We couldn't pass it, too much money, $14 billion. They're going to come back and cut and cut and cut in the name of trying to deal with deficit, the high deficit, which they are now increasing. And that's an issue that we must be addressing. So, Mr. President, in my view, while there are some good parts of the proposal, it is certainly one that should be significantly improved. And I believe that the way it can be improved is by the American people beginning to get involved in the process. I can tell you, as I said earlier, I don't know how the calls are going today in my office because I have been here, but for the last 3 days we have received thousands of phone calls and emails, and over 98% of them have been against this proposal. The American people believe, people in Vermont believe, that we can do a lot better job in crafting a proposal that represents the middle class and our kids, and not just the wealthiest people in this country. Mr. President, when we talk about this proposal negotiated by the White House and Republican leadership, again, it has to be put within the broad context of what's going on in America. And that context is not a pretty picture. That context requires us to understand that the middle class, which has been the backbone of this country for so very long, is in the process of disappearing. And that context makes us understand that millions of families in this country are worried, parents are worried, not just about their own lives. They're prepared to work 50 or 60 hours a week. They're prepared to cut back on their own needs. But I think what is hurting them more deeply is the kind of future they are contemplating for their children. They are worried that for the first time in the modern history of America, their kids will get jobs which will pay them lower salaries than what the parents have earned. They are worried that unemployment will be much more likely for their kids than for themselves. They'll be worried that while they were able to scrape through, and in my case, I was able to scrape through college, borrowed some money and did some jobs and made it like millions of other people. They're worried that with the high cost of college education and the reduction in their real earnings, they're not going to be able to send their kids to college. And I have received emails, as I'm sure you have, Mr. President, the saddest thing in the world. We have parents who are saying, we've saved all of our lives. The thing that we wanted most is to be able to send our daughter or our son to college, but we can't afford to do that now. And that is the context, the overall context that this agreement has got to be placed within. And the issue is, again and again and again, the richest people in this country do not need tax breaks. They are doing phenomenally well. They've already been given huge amounts of tax breaks. It is the middle class, it is the working families, it is the lower income people that we have got to be worrying about, and not just the wealthy and the powerful. Mr. President, when we talk about why the middle class is declining, that is a tough issue, and I'm not here to suggest that I know all of the answers. I surely don't. It's a complicated issue. Honest people have differences of opinions. But let me touch on a few areas that I think will explain why poverty is going up and the middle class is going down. And one of them deals with our trade policies. I can remember, Mr. President, a number of years ago, I was in the House of Representatives, and I can remember the lobbyists and the big money interests coming around and saying, well, if you guys only pass NAFTA, this would create a whole lot of jobs in the United States because we would be able to ship products made in America to Mexico. And in fact, as I recall, and it seems almost humorous now, what they said is that if we passed NAFTA, it would solve the problem of illegal immigration because the economy of Mexico would be so strong that people would stay in their own country and not try to sneak across the border. That is, as we look back at it, somewhat humorous that that issue was even discussed. But one of the reasons, Mr. President, that unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, we have not dealt with is our disastrous trade policy. And that is NAFTA. That is permanent, normal trade relation. That is trade policies which have encouraged large corporations in this country to send jobs abroad because they can find workers in other countries, in low-wage countries, who are prepared to work for pennies an hour. And you know, I think we have not only haven't we addressed this issue from an economic perspective the way we should, and I have to tell you, Mr. President, I know that during campaigns, a lot of members of Congress put their 30-second ads on the air saying how concerned they are about outsourcing and our trade policy. But somehow the day after the election, I don't hear that discussion resumed on the floor of the House and the Senate. And I want to say this is true, not just of Republicans, but of Democrats as well. A lot of Democrats campaign on the need for trade reform, but it doesn't happen. In fact, I've been here in the Senate now for almost 4 years, and I have not heard one serious, underlying serious discussion to explain how in recent years we have lost millions and millions of manufacturing jobs when those jobs were the backbone of the working class of this country, not providing not only decent wages, but decent benefits, decent health care, decent pensions. Mr. President, there was once a time in this country when a manufacturing job was a ticket to the middle class. And I got to say something, because I remember not so many years ago, there were national leaders saying, well, to the young people, you don't have to worry about that factory work anymore. You don't have to be involved in production because, you know what, all of the jobs in the future is going to be nice and clean in offices and on computers. And I think we demeaned and insulted the people who built the products that we consume. There is nothing wrong with a factory job if workers there earn a decent wage and have a decent benefit. Those are the jobs that built America. You know, and I remember, we should never forget that, and we now have celebrated just the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And there was a speech that President Roosevelt gave a day after Pearl Harbor in a joint session of the Congress when he declared war on Japan. And I saw a video of that speech, and it was really a remarkable speech because at that moment, the United States was not only fighting Japan, we knew the fight with Germany and Nazism was right around the corner. And at that point, we were having to fight a war on two fronts, in Asia and in Europe. Hitler was on the march, the Japanese were in China, Japanese had just attacked Pearl Harbor. And here we were, just about to enter the war. How could we possibly win that war? And yet, Mr. President, because of the manufacturing capabilities that we had in that time, and this is an amazing story, literally in 2.5 years, the war was essentially won, obviously not completed until 1945. But because of the incredible industrial capabilities in this country, The ability to transform our manufacturing sector from a consumer-oriented sector, from automobiles into tanks, from shirts into uniforms, from hunting rifles into machine guns. Within 2-3 years, we had essentially won that war. It was an incredible effort on the part of workers in this country who transformed our economy into an industrial force that was able to supply our soldiers with the weapons that they needed to defeat Hitler and the Japanese. And where are we today in terms of our manufacturing capabilities? As I mentioned earlier, a couple of weeks ago, my wife and I went shopping for Christmas presents, literally, just a plain old department store. Literally very hard to find a product not manufactured in China. Very hard to find a product, a gift that we could buy that was manufactured in the United States of America. And I think people understand instinctually that this country will not be a major economic player in years to come if we allow our manufacturing base to continue to decline. Again, just under Bush, we went from 17 million manufacturing jobs down to 12 million jobs in 8 years of Bush. How do we survive as a strong industrial power if our manufacturing jobs disappear? Today, Mr. President, there are fewer manufacturing jobs in this country than there were in April of 1941, about 8 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Fewer manufacturing jobs today than in April of 1941. And those manufacturing jobs that are left, in many cases pay lower wages with fewer benefits than they did a generation ago. In other words, we are moving not only in a decline in our manufacturing jobs, but in the wages that our workers earn and the benefits that they receive. And I raise all of these issues to put this agreement between the President and the Republican leadership in a broader context. Today, and this is just an incredible fact, and it is just absolutely frightening for the future of the middle class in this country. Today, entry-level automobile workers at General Motors and Chrysler now earn half as much as their peers made just 1 year ago. Instead of making $28 an hour, a middle-class wage, they are now making $14 an hour. And this is in the automobile industry, which has always been the gold standard for manufacturing jobs in America. And if workers with a union in the automobile industry are making $14 an hour, what do you think workers in New Mexico are going to be making without a strong union? So what you're seeing is a dissolution of the middle class. Wages are going down, and in this remarkable example, a 50% reduction. The older workers making good wages, new workers half the wages. Is this the future of America? Is this what our kids have to look forward to? That they're going to be earning half the wages that their fathers made, that their mothers made? Is that the future? And in the midst of all of that, we run up a huge national debt, send our jobs to China, and we give tax breaks to millionaires? Is that the future these kids have to look forward to? I certainly hope not. But let me tell you something, we're going to have to be tough, and we're going to have to take on some very powerful special interests to turn this whole thing around. Mr. President, we often talk, and today I've been voting a lot of time to our national debt, $13.7 trillion, and to our deficit, which is $1.4 trillion, but we cannot ignore our trade deficit. In 2008, our trade deficit was nearly $700 billion. Last year, our trade deficit with China alone was almost $227 billion. In other words, we are purchasing a whole lot more product than we are selling. And sometimes I get a kick out of hearing the defenders of our trade policy talk about all of the product that we are exporting. Well, yeah, we are exporting a lot, but we are importing a heck of a lot more. So, Mr. President, I think what you got is a major economic issue here, and that economic issue is that we are losing millions of good-paying jobs because of our disastrous trade policies, and furthermore, the jobs that we have. On those jobs, we're seeing a decline in wages and in benefits. And I think the bottom line of this is not just, if you like, an economic issue, it's a moral issue as well. And that is when companies like General Electric and all the rest, I don't mean to be picking hard on General Electric, but I have a quote here, which I want to make. This was a few years back. I think it's important because it applies not just to General Electric, but I want people to hear this. GE is, of course, one of our major corporations, and in fact, as recent disclosure pointed out, the taxpayers of this country through the Fed provided $16 billion in bailout to General Electric during the recent crisis. This is what the head of CEO of General Electric, Jeffrey Immelt, said in 2002, December 6th. Quote, Jeff Immelt, head of CEO. When I am talking to GE managers, I talk China, 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 China. 5 Chinas. You need to be there. You need to change the way people talk about it and how they get there. I am a nut on China. Outsourcing from China is going to grow to $5 billion. We are building a tech center in China. Every discussion today has to center on China. The cost basis is extremely attractive. You can take an 18 cubic foot refrigerator, make it in China, land it in the United States, and land it for less than we can make an 18 cubic foot refrigerator today ourselves. End of quote. Jeffrey Immelt, Chairman, CEO of General Electric, quoted in an investor meeting on December 6, 2002. When GE recently had, a couple of years ago, some really difficult economic times, they needed $16 billion to bail them out. I didn't hear Mr. Immelt going to China, 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 China. I didn't hear that. I heard Mr. Immelt going to the taxpayers of the United States for his welfare check. So I say to Mr. Immelt, and I say to all of these CEOs who have been so quick to run to China, that maybe it's time to start reinvesting in the United States of America. But it's not just Mr. Immelt. And I don't mean to just pick on him, it's all of them. They all see the future in China, in Vietnam, in countries where people work for pennies an hour. Now, Mr. Immelt came to his position in the footsteps of the former CEO of GE, Jack Welch. And what Jack Welch was famously quoted as saying, quote, ideally, this is the guy who was head of General Electric before Immelt. He said, ideally, we'd have every plant we own on a barge. End of quote. Remember that quote? He said, we'd have ideally every plant we own on a barge. What did he mean by that? What he meant by that, if you're on a barge, you can move your plant to any part of the world where the labor is cheapest. So if it gets too expensive in China and you got to pay people 75 cents an hour, you go to Vietnam. If it gets too expensive in Vietnam, maybe you can go to North Korea and have people work under martial law. I don't know. But what he was saying is his goal was to make sure that GE would create jobs in those countries in the world where workers were paid the lowest possible wages. Former GE Executive Vice President Frank Doyle said, and I quote, we did a lot of violence to the expectations of the American workforce. We downsized, we delayered, and we outsourced. He was honest enough to admit it. But again, I don't mean to just pick on Jeff Immelt or General Electric. It is a history of corporations all over America. Let me just mention that the CEO of Cisco, John Chambers, and this is what he says. Then, we tell the young people the future is in information technology. We want you guys to be smart, learn how to use the computers. You're not going to work in factories. This is what the CEO of Cisco, certainly one of the large IT companies in the United States, said. He said, quote, China will become the IT center of the world, and we can have a healthy discussion about whether that's in 2020 or 2040. What we are trying to do is outline an entire strategy of becoming a Chinese company. End of quote. John Chambers, CEO of Cisco. This was in 2004. Furthermore, he says, October 15, 2004, this is Cisco, we believe in giving something back and truly becoming a Chinese company. Meanwhile, when Cisco needs tax breaks, they get it from the taxpayers of the United States of America. Boy, are they taking us for dummies. They outsource their jobs to China and so forth. Now, in the last campaign, one of the folks who ended up getting a lot more publicity, I think, than he usually does, is the president and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a gentleman named Tom Donahue. And again, my point tonight is not just to pick on individuals, because every quote that I'm giving you now can be multiplied 50, 100 times over. This is what corporate America believes. They believe that it is totally appropriate to throw American workers out on the street, move to low-wage countries, China and other countries, pay people a few cents an hour, bring their products back into the United States. Thomas Donahue is the president and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and he got a lot of publicity recently, especially during the last election, because the Chamber of Commerce became the funnel for a lot of money that went into campaigns around this country. They raised tens and tens of millions of dollars. A lot of that money, I believe, was undisclosed. So all the rich folks and billionaires gave money to the Chamber of Commerce, and they were able to elect candidates that were sympathetic to their point of view. So let's find out what their point of view is. This is a quote, again, going back to 2004. Thomas Donahue, CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Quote, one job sent overseas, if it happens to be my job, is one too many. But the benefits of offshoring jobs outweighs the cost. End of quote. Tom Donahue, President and CEO of the largest business organization in America. They are in favor of offshoring American jobs. They think it is a good idea because they understand that if corporations throw American workers out on the street and go to China and pay people their pennies an hour, they are going to make more profits. That's what they say. Give them credit. They're upfront about it. We don't care about the United States of America. We don't care about young people. We don't care about the future of this country. Jeff Inmel told us the future of the world is in China. And here is a quote that appeared in one of the papers. U.S. Chamber of Commerce President CEO Thomas Donahue urged American companies to send jobs overseas. I don't know if we have a date on that quote. In 2004, we think it is. Let me repeat that. In one of the newspapers. an AP story. U.S. Chamber of Commerce President and CEO Thomas Donahue. This is the head of the largest business organization in America. That's where all these businesses come together to develop policy, to lobby us, to provide campaign contributions. U.S. Chamber of Commerce President and CEO Thomas Donahue urged American companies to send jobs overseas. Now that's really patriotic. That's standing up for the United States of America. Donahue said Wednesday that exporting high-paid tech jobs to low-cost countries such as India, China, and Russia saves companies money. It is no surprise that Donahue, who tripled the Chamber of Commerce's lobbying team since 1997 and aggressively promotes pro-business policies, endorses offshoring. The 3 million member organizations of the Chamber of Commerce, the world's largest business consortium, champions tax cuts, free trade, workers' compensation reform, and more liberal trade policies with China. End of quote. What more do you need when you want to understand why we have lost millions of good-paying manufacturing jobs, why wages are going down? What more do you need when the president of the Chamber of Commerce tells you that he thinks it is good public policy to send jobs to China? So I don't think there is, much that you have to, discover. They're telling you this. Now, in a moment, what I'm going to be talking about is how these ideas from the big money people become implemented into policy, which has to do a lot with lobbying and campaign contributions. I want to about how the business leaders of this country feel about the workers of this country and the young people of this country. This again is a quote that I apologize, it is a few years old, 2004 perhaps. 2004. Quote, January 19. This is from Alan Lacey, the CEO, who was then the CEO of Sears Roebuck and Company. Look what he said, quote, there are 4 or 5 times as many smart, driven people in China than there are in the United States. And there's another 4 or 5, 3 or 4 times as many people in India that are smarter or as smart or have more drive. And if technology is now going to basically reduce location as a barrier to competition, i.e. you have a worldwide web and you can do your work in China or India, then essentially you've got something like whatever that was, 7 or 9 times more smart, committed people that are now competing in this marketplace against certain activities. So we're going to see, I think, this huge incentive to shift some of these more commodity-like knowledge workers' jobs offshore. So here you have our blue-collar jobs decimated, and we told the kids not to worry. You didn't want to work in a factory anyhow. We've got these good information technology, computer-based jobs for you. But then you have the heads of large corporations saying, hey, why do I want to get American young people to do this? I can have Indian young people do it who work for a fraction of the wages. And I think we all see this. I mean, it's nothing new. You try to get a plane reservation right now and you're talking to somebody in India. And please do not hear me to be anti-India or anti-Chinese. That is the furthest thing that I would want anyone to think. We want to work with people all over the world. But you don't have to destroy the middle class of this country to help people around the world. You don't have to be a corporate CEO to sell out your own people who built your company to run abroad. So this senator is not anti-Chinese, far from it, anti-Indian, anti-Vietnamese, not at all. I guess I plead guilty to being pro-American. I don't know. Maybe that's suspect here. Former CEO of Hewlett Packard, Carly Fiorina. That's obviously Ms. Fiorina ran for senator. This is what she said when she was the CEO of Hewlett Packard in 2004. She said, quote, there is no job that is America's God-given right anymore, end of quote. I could go on and on and on, but I think you got the point. And the point is that when things get rough for corporate America, as they did recently for General Electric, they run to the taxpayers of this country in order to be bailed out. But their overall philosophy is that their goal in life is to make as much money as they can in any way they can, and therefore you run to those countries where wages are low. And what you're seeing now, and you're seeing it all of the time, and it's not just blue collar, it is increasingly white collar. You have radiologists who are able to read x-rays in India. You have people behind the computer can do work in India as well as here. And these corporate folks have taken advantage of that and sold out the young people of this country and the working class of this country. Mr. President, as you know, it is virtually impossible to find anything in a Walmart or other stores like that that is made in America today. This is especially true for clothing. An increasing amount of our clothing comes from Bangladesh. Today, there are 4,000 garment factories in Bangladesh making clothes for Walmart, Gap, JCPenney, Levi Strauss, Tommy Hilfiger, and many, many others. Garment workers in Bangladesh, some 3.5 million of them, and that number is growing, are among the lowest paid workers in the world, and they have difficulty buying enough food and shelter for their own needs. As I mentioned earlier today, the good news is the minimum wage in Bangladesh was doubled. It went from 11.5 cents an hour to 23 cents an hour. So when you buy a shirt made in Bangladesh, you have young women there coming in from the countryside who are paid now, have received a doubling of their minimum wage to 23 cents an hour. Is that something that our people should be asked to compete against? Should we say to the American worker, hey, we can get you jobs. We're prepared to invest in the United States. Yeah, we're an American company. You helped make us great. Thank you for the work you've done over the years. Thank you for purchasing our products. Thank you for making us strong. And if you are prepared to work for $1 an hour, $2 an hour, $3 an hour, we'll come back. And by the way, Mr. President, I think you know this. In the last campaign, what did we hear? What are we beginning to hear rumbles about? Abolishing the minimum wage. Abolishing the minimum wage. Minimum wage now is, what is it, $7.50 an hour. That's what we say should be $7.25 an hour. That's what we say should be the minimum that any American worker gets. There are people out there who say, look, if I can hire somebody in China for $2 or $3 an hour, and you want a job in America, and I have to pay you $7.25 an hour, why would I want to do that? If we abolish the minimum wage, hey, I may hire you. Now, what a wonderful prospect for our young people to think about working for $4 or $5 an hour. So, Mr. President, I think if we want to understand why the middle class in this country is collapsing, why unemployment is high, why our manufacturing base has been decimated, why it is hard to purchase a product made in the United States, it has a lot to do with our trade policies, which were pushed by people like Mr. Donahue of the Chamber of Commerce and many, many others. But it is not just a disastrous trade policy that has brought us to where we are today. The immediate cause of this crisis is, just gets me sick thinking about it, and that is what the crooks on Wall Street have done to the American people. These people fought for a period of years to deregulate the banking industry. These people said to us, well, if you just would do away with Glass-Steagall, if you will just allow financial institutions, commercial banks, investor banks, insurance companies, if you allow them to merge, do away with these walls, which Glass-Steagall since the Depression had established, my God, it would be just terrific. It would be good for our economy, good for the American people, good for our international competitiveness. And I remember those debates, Mr. President, because I was at that point in the House of Representatives. I was a member of the Financial Institutions Committee at that point, and I was on the committee that dealt with that. And I remember all of the times that Alan Greenspan came before the committee and said, and Robert Rubin, you had Republicans, you had Democrats, coming before the committee and saying, it's what you got to do. You got to deregulate. You got to let these guys merge. Bigger is better. And against my votes. I mean, somewhere on the internet there is a discussion that I had with Alan Greenspan when he came before our committee. And I made it very clear to the people of Vermont, to him and to everybody else, that I did not think deregulation was a good idea, that I thought it would lead to disaster. And someplace in this world, there is a quote of mine which kind of pretty much predicts what was going to happen. But needless to say, I was one vote, and majority of the members in the House and Senate voted to deregulate. And the rest is, unfortunately, history. And what we saw is that people on Wall Street, I think, I may be wrong on this, but I think operating from a business model based on fraud, based on dishonesty, understanding that the likelihood of them ever getting caught was small, that if things got really bad, they would be bailed out by the taxpayers, understanding that they are too powerful to ever be put in jail, to be indicted, understanding that in this country, when you're a CEO on Wall Street, you have so much wealth and so much power and have so many lawyers and so many friends in Congress that you could do pretty much anything you want and not much is going to happen to you. And they did it. They did it. Their greed and their recklessness and their illegal behavior destroyed this economy. And what they did to the American people is so horrible, so horrible. So here you had a middle class which is already being battered, as we discussed, as a result of trade agreements, loss of manufacturing jobs, healthcare costs going up, can't afford to send your kid to college. That's going on for years. And then these guys start pushing worthless and complicated financial instruments. The whole thing explodes. The whole thing explodes. And they come crying to the taxpayers of America to bail them out. And I will never forget, Hank Paulson coming before it was the Democratic caucus. I'm an independent, I'm the longest serving independent in Congress. Coming before the Democratic caucus, saying that within a few days he needed $700 billion or the entire world financial system would collapse. And my suggestion to him at that meeting is, if you need the money, why don't you go to your friends and get the money? Why don't you go to all your banker friends and your millionaire friends and your billionaire friends and get some of that money, and don't go to the middle class of this country that has already been harmed. And in fact, we brought an amendment here to the floor of the Senate. One of the first amendments that I brought as a senator, which the amendment was that the top 2% should pay for the bailout, not the American people. It got defeated in a voice vote. So what goes on in Wall Street is that we have seen a tremendous concentration of ownership there. Another issue that we do not talk enough about. I know Senator Brown and Senator Kaufman and I worked on a proposal to try to break up these large financial institutions. I think we got 30 some odd votes on that, couldn't do it. So what the American people should know now is that while we bailed out Wall Street because they were quote unquote too big to fail, 3 out of the 4 largest financial institutions, all of whom were bailed out very significantly, are now larger today than they were before the bailout. Incredibly, since the start of the financial crisis, Wells Fargo has grown 43% bigger, JP Morgan Chase has grown 51% bigger, and Bank of America is now 138% larger than before the financial crisis began. Can you imagine that? We bailed these guys out because they were too big to fail, and now 3 out of the 4 largest ones are much larger than they were. How did that happen? Well, in 2008, Bank of America, the largest commercial bank in this country, which received a $45 billion taxpayer bailout, purchased Countrywide, the largest mortgage lender in this country, and Merrill Lynch, the largest stock brokerage firm in the country. That's how Bank of America expanded. They were too big to fail. Today, much bigger. In 2008, JP Morgan Chase, which received a $25 billion bailout from the Bush Treasury Department and a $29 billion bridge loan from the Federal Reserve, acquired Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual, the largest savings and loan in the country. That's how JP Morgan Chase, a huge bank, became even bigger. In 2008, the Treasury Department provided an $18 billion tax break to Wells Fargo to purchase Wachovia, allowing that bank to control 11% of all bank deposits in this country. Hear this, Mr. President, because this is just quite unbelievable. When we try to understand what's going on in the economy today, the rich getting richer, poor getting poorer, middle class collapsing. Today, after we bailed out all of these large banks, 3 out of 4 of them are now much larger than they were before. And today, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo, the 4 largest financial institutions in this country, hold about $7.4 trillion in assets, and that is equal to over half of the nation's estimated total output last year. 4 financial institutions have assets worth more than 52% of our total output last year. And instead of allowing them instead of breaking these folks up, these large institutions up, we let them get bigger. In fact, Mr. President, according to Simon Johnson, the former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, quote, as a result of the crisis and various government rescue efforts, the largest 6 banks in our economy now have total assets in excess, he claims, of 63% of GDP. This is a significant increase from even 2006, when the same bank's assets were around 55% of GDP. You understand what this is about? 4 financial institutions owning over half of the assets of America. You talk about economic power. You talk about political power. That is what we were talking about. Simon Johnson continues, he said, this is a complete transformation compared with the situation in the United States just 15 years ago, when the largest 6 banks had combined assets of only about 17% of GDP. So today, 15 years ago, 17%, 6 banks, today 4 banks, he claims 63% of GDP. In other words, Mr. President, over the last 15 years, the largest banks in this country have more than tripled in size. Now, Mr. President, not only are too big to fail financial institutions bad for taxpayers, the enormous concentration of ownership in the financial sector has led to higher bank fees, usurious interest rates on credit cards, and fewer choices for consumers. What do you think happens when you have a few institutions, a handful of institutions, controlling mortgage lending or the ability of people, where people get their credit cards? Today, Mr. President, these huge financial institutions have become so big that, according to the Washington Post, the 4 largest banks in America now issue 1 out of every 2 mortgages, 2 out of 3 credit cards, and hold 4 out of every $10 in bank deposits in the entire country. Mr. President, if any of these financial institutions were to get into major trouble again, taxpayers would be on the hook for another substantial bailout, and we cannot allow that to happen. So the whole reason for the bailout is that if any of these financial institutions collapsed, it would take down a significant part of the economy and millions of jobs. We had to prop them up. We had to bail them out. And it turns out that since we bailed them out, these handful of financial institutions are now even larger than they were before. And we now know they are enjoying very strong profits, and they are paying their CEOs even more in compensation than they did before the breakdown. In my view, Mr. President, if we are serious about understanding why the middle class is collapsing, if we are serious about really getting this economy moving again, long term, we have got to have the courage to to do exactly what Teddy Roosevelt did back in the trust-busting days and break these banks up. The point that Roosevelt was making is that it is bad for the economy when a handful of entities control industry after industry. They have a stranglehold on the economy. You got to break them up. And yet, I have heard very little discussion. I know there was an amendment from Sherrod Brown and Ted Kaufman, and I introduced legislation on this issue to start breaking them up. But frankly, their lobbyists and their money are such that it becomes very difficult to do that. But that is exactly what we should be doing. The legislation that I introduced last year, S-2746, the Too Big to Fail, Too Big to Exist Act, would break up these large financial institutions. That legislation would require the Secretary of Treasury to identify every single financial institution and insurance company in this country that is too big to fail within 90 days. And after 1 year, the Secretary of the Treasury would be required to break up these institutions so that their failure would not lead to the collapse of the U.S. or global economy. I think that is pretty obvious. We passed a financial reform bill, which I supported and got a major provision in there asking for disclosure of the Fed and an investigation of conflicts of interest at the Fed and an audit of the Fed during the financial crisis. But overall, I by no means think that legislation went anywhere near far enough. I think it was a modest piece of legislation, and I think that's an issue we've got to revisit. In my view, Mr. President, and I worry very much about the future because I have the feeling in my stomach that day is going to come around again when these huge financial institutions are tottering, and they're going to go running to Washington and they're going to say, hey, you got to bail us out. In my view, if an institution is too big to fail, it is too big to exist. Let us break them up so that we do not have to go through another bailout of Wall Street. Furthermore, I believe that when you have that kind of concentration of ownership, when you have 4 large financial institutions holding half the mortgages in this country, controlling 2/3 of the credit cards, and amassing 40% of all deposits, this is not good for a competitive economy. We're supposed to be living in free market capitalism, real competition. This is not free market competition. This is a huge concentration of ownership where a few people have enormous power over the economy and, with their wealth, the political life of this country. No single financial institution should be so large that its failure would cause catastrophic risk to millions of American jobs or to our nation's economic well-being. No single financial institution should have holdings so extensive that its failure could send the world's economy into crisis. We were there 2 years ago, and in many ways, despite the passage of the financial reform bill, we are even more there now. The big, huge financial institutions that we bailed out are bigger, more huge today. And interestingly enough, on that issue, Mr. President, it is not just progressives like myself who hold that view. There's some pretty conservative folks who are honest conservatives. Is concentration of ownership in a handful of entities, is that a conservative proposition? Not in terms of my understanding what conservatives are about. I don't think so. You have at least 3 Federal Reserve Bank presidents that support breaking up too big to fail banks. James Bullard, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, President and Chief Executive of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, Kansas City Fed President Thomas M. Honig, and Dallas Fed President Richard W. Fisher. These guys don't have my political views. I am a proud progressive. My guess is they're conservatives. But anybody with an ounce of brains in your head understands that 4 large financial institutions that have assets that are more than half of the GDP of the United States of America places us, A, in a very dangerous position in terms of too big to fail, and B, it is just bad for a competitive economy. Is there any wonder why people are paying 25 to 30% interest rates on their credit cards? That's because these guys issue 2/3 of the credit cards in America. Is there any reason why they were issuing fraudulent mortgage packages to people? Because there is not the kind of competition that should be there. But this is not just Bernie Sanders' point of view. Here is what Kansas City Fed President Honig said, and I quote. Sorry, I don't have the date on this, but I think it was fairly recently. Last year. This is Kansas City Fed President Honig. Quote, I think they should be broken up. I think there's no reason why, as we've done in other instances, of finding the right mechanism to break them into their components. And in doing so, I think you'll make the financial system itself more stable. I think you will make it more competitive. And I think you will have long-run benefits over our current system, which mixes it and therefore leads to bailouts when crises occur. End of quote. This is Thomas Honig, the head of the Fed, Kansas City Fed. Right? Very simple statement, and he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. But, and I'm going to get to the reason why in a little while, we've not been able to do this. We've not been able to do this because Wall Street sends their lobbyists down here in droves, and Wall Street provides zillions of dollars in campaign contributions, and Wall Street fights like the Dickens to make sure that any strong provisions that some of us might bring up is defeated. Here is what the president of the Dallas Fed, Mr. Fisher, said, quote, based on my experience at the Fed, the marginal cost of too big to fail financial institutions easily dwarf their purported social and macroeconomic benefits. The risk posed by coddling too big to fail banks is simply too great. Winston Churchill said that, he's quoting Winston Churchill, in finance, everything that is agreeable is unsound, and everything that is sound is disagreeable. End of quote. That's from Churchill. And Mr. Fisher continues, I think the disagreeable but sound thing to do regarding institutions that are too big to fail is to dismantle them over time into institutions that can be prudently managed and regulated across borders. And this should be done before the next financial crisis, because we now know it surely cannot be done in the middle of a crisis. End of quote. And that's Dallas Fed President Mr. Fisher. Mr. President, they are already in the process of breaking up big banks in England. According to the Washington Post, the British government announced Tuesday, not this Tuesday, that's way back last year. The British government announced a while back that it will break up parts of major financial institutions bailed out by taxpayers. The British government, spurred on by European regulators, is forcing the Royal Bank of Scotland, Lloyds Banking Group, and Northern Rock to sell off parts of their operations. Europeans are calling for more and smaller banks to increase competition and eliminate the threat posed by banks so large that they must be regulated. They must be rescued. They must be rescued by taxpayers, no matter how they conducted their business, in order to avoid damaging the global financial system. Mr. President, very interesting development occurred on October 15th of last year. On October 15th, and as I mentioned earlier, Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Fed before Mr. Bernanke, and I had our run-ins. Mr. Greenspan, along with Mr. Rubin and others, were the chief proponents, Larry Summers in there, were the chief proponents of deregulation of financial institutions. And Mr. Greenspan and I had more than a few arguments. But on October 15th of last year, Alan Greenspan, who admitted that his views on deregulation were wrong, and I give the man courage for at least admitting that he was wrong. Did a heck of a lot of damage, but at least he had the courage to admit that he was wrong. He was quoted in Bloomberg News as saying, and I quote, "If they're too big to fail, they're too big." In 1911, we broke up Standard Oil, so what happened? The individual parts became more valuable than the whole. Maybe that's what we need to do. End of quote. Alan Greenspan, the architect of deregulation, citing the fact that in 1911 we broke up Standard Oil. So here you have Greenspan who helped cause this crisis, at least having the courage to understand that now is the time to begin breaking up these big financial institutions. They have enormous power over our economy. They have enormous power over our political life. Their lobbyists are all over this place. And you can't walk down the hall without bumping into some of their lobbyists. So we've got to start breaking them up, and the American people have got to be prepared for a major fight to take on these huge financial institutions. Mr. President, former Fed Chairman Paul Volcker, who has advised the Obama administration, supports breaking up big banks so that they no longer pose systemic risk to the entire economy. According to a recent article in the New York Times, Volcker said, and I quote, "People say I'm old-fashioned, and banks can no longer be separated from non-bank activity. That argument brought us to where we are today," end of quote, Paul Volcker. I couldn't agree more. That's what I'm talking about. You've got to start breaking up four financial institutions which led us into the economic disaster we're in right now, that remain much too big to fail, that we're going to have to bail out again and again and again, and that today have a stranglehold on our economy. The New York Times said that under Volcker's plan, quote, J.P. Morgan Chase would have to give up the trading operations acquired from Bear Stearns. Bank of America and Merrill Lynch would go back to being separate companies. Goldman Sachs could no longer be a bank holding company. End of quote. That's exactly what needs to be happening. The reality is, and I come from a small state, we have community banks. Here's the irony, Mr. President. The banks in Vermont, in the midst of all of this financial disaster, they did just fine. They are small, locally owned banks. They know the people they lend money to. The CEOs are not making hundreds of millions of dollars in profit. They know their community. They know what loans made sense. Now, I may be old-fashioned like Mr. Volcker, but I think that's what banking is about. To lend out money to people in the productive economy, the business community that can use the money to expand, create jobs, to homeowners that need that money to buy a home, not to be living in your own world, engaged in a huge gambling casino, producing and selling worthless products that nobody understands. The function of a bank is to be a middleman between people who need money and are producing real products and helping them get that money, and people who are investing in the banks. It is not supposed to be an island unto itself. But in recent years, what we have seen, incredibly, 40% of all profits in America went to the financial institutions. Small number of people working there, relatively small. 40% of the profits, because they live in a world. It is a huge gambling casino. We need financial institutions to go back to the way banking used to be. And the job of banks is to provide affordable loans to the productive economy so that we can produce real products, real goods, and we can create real jobs when we do that. Robert Reich, President Clinton's former labor secretary, has said, quote, "No important public interest is served by allowing giant banks to grow too big to fail. Wall Street banks should be split up, and soon." We've got a lot of people, some conservatives, some progressives, are saying the same thing. If we're going to rebuild the middle class, the way to do that is, among other things, to change our disastrous trade policies, to make it clear to corporate America that they cannot continue to sell out the workers of this country by moving to China, other low-wage countries. And we also have got to have a much more competitive economy, one in which 4 large financial institutions do not own assets of more than half of the GDP of this country. And on that point, I find it very interesting that it's not just progressives like myself or Robert Reich, but you have some conservative bankers, people who are heading Fed banks around this country, who are saying pretty much the same thing.